We will start with the next session. I assume it's gonna be intellectually fruitful, but also entertaining. With our two speakers, it's Danish citizen Lars Tvede, who lived in Switzerland, and lives in Switzerland. Extremely successful author of many books. And the second speaker will be Dr. Berg. He's a highly successful business person here in Switzerland, and I'm also happy he's a proud donor of Avenir Swiss. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you very much that we can be here. In contrast to these distinguished scientists that sit in the room, you will have a little bit more practical guys, and bear with us if we're not that perfect in causality. Sometimes it'll be correlation. My name is
But we do have an equation, and your equation, we have one.
We have one equation, that's right. My name is Berg. I'm originally Danish. I have lived here since '77. I work and hunt and enjoy the mountains. There is no ocean here. In contrast to Denmark, I've been consultant with Emskini and a couple of other things, also been on the board some years for the Swiss Avenir Swiss. I'm fascinated by Switzerland and Denmark and the differences. That's why you see the two ones. What about you, young man?
I'm not that young actually, but I've been here 23 years. I came as an entrepreneur, started different companies. Now I run a venture capital fund, which I co-founded. And I have had the cultural shock of coming from Denmark to Switzerland. I think the first cultural shock for me was when I got my first tax bill. And I felt like I was on candid camera, there was something wrong. It couldn't be right that it was so small. But there are many things, many observations I made, most of them very positive. The healthcare system in Switzerland is absolutely fantastic. No waiting list and so on. I was amazed also by how the trains run. In Denmark, sometimes there was a problem that the trains stop because there are leaves on the rails. And so in Switzerland, you have 2 meters of snow and so on, and the trains keep running. So they have their challenges, but somehow they manage to get the trains through. So Switzerland works very well. As you all know, it's very clean. The houses, the streets, and so on. The cars are clean, and it took me a while before I realized that that has got something to do with the way the farming works in this way here. So, so I've been through this, and Wolf, are you interested in politics?
Well, yes, I am interested in politics, but in all fairness, I'm not politician or anything, although I'm the boss of Mrs. Matula, who is part of the Swiss Folk Party. I'm not politically active, but I love to look at social drivers for societal development.
So,
and you?
Yeah, so actually I stumbled into politics because my fiancée is a leader of a political party in Denmark, so in that way I am. But I think she might get some of the farm vote, by the way. But apart from that, I've written various books, and most of them about technology and so on, but 2 of them are actually about politics, and one of them is available out there. I think some of you already picked it up. It's called The Creative Society. The other one is in Danish, and that's about libertarianism and conservatism and collectivism, how they work in society.
Well, enough personal stories. Let's go down to it. Inequality, equality, a lot about Gini index. We've seen a lot about it. We want to take a little bit longer picture. Lars, you go ahead.
Yes, the first question is, how has inequality developed? And I think that one important thing to consider is, what is better, that the poor are here and the rich are here, or that the poor are here and the rich are here? So one good thing about the world economy is that we're all getting richer. This is the income distribution in the world in 1820, where the vast majority of the people were very poor. Then we got to 1970, where you had a clear division between poor countries and rich countries. And probably many of you have read Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, where he writes about that from his studies also of educated people. Many people think the world is like this today, but it's no longer like this. It's more a world that has a huge middle class. So in that way it has developed very well, and then one can ask, how did that happen? And a big part of the reason is that you have had great income growth in Asia and Pacific. And if you study the details of that, it turns out that China is really important. So China has moved like 400 million people out of very, very poor conditions and into the middle class. This is the economy of China from 1950 until close to the present day. And we had the great leap forward, which wasn't really a leap forward if you look at the income. But then you had the change to market economy, and then this happened. So this is the main driver of reduced inequality in the world. So when we talk about inequality, we talk about it on a nation, single nation basis. But if you look at the whole world as a nation, inequality has fallen while we have become a lot more wealthy.
And we are Westerners, we want to look at our numbers, and our numbers look a little bit different. I've looked at the US and 4 Western countries, and it's the Piketty numbers you see here. As we see, it didn't go well in some of the years. Then it went better after 1900. Then there was a crossover for the EU around 1960. Same for the top 1% and the top 10% of this crossover. And I believe that's the time of Wirtschaftswunder. That's the time where a lot of things of resurrection after World War II happened. And this is probably one of the reasons that we see that. If you look more at income, you here see that English-speaking countries, apparently these numbers are from our World in Data, but they show that there is an increase in inequality in the terms of income. That's not all Gini, that's true income, whereas other countries don't have it. I actually believe you then go into some Latin countries, you will see similar things like you see on the left. And that's something that I think we should be aware of that may not entirely be bad, or?
Yeah, so the one thing to consider is that sometimes when you see a sudden rise in inequality, it might be for good reason. It can be for bad, but it might be for good reasons. So this is Jeff Bezos when he was not that wealthy. And this is 1998, is 4 years after that photo was taken, and 2017 is close to the present day. And what you can see is you get more fit when you get more wealthy. But apart from that, what we all have to consider, I know you know that, but we have to bear in mind that if Jeff Bezos moved to Zurich, inequality would go up in Zurich, but that wouldn't hurt anybody. So what there is a tendency to happen, and I know this because I'm a venture capitalist, is that the Anglo-Saxons, so the UK and US and so on, are extremely good at making these instant global empires. And in the old days, when you build industrial companies like some of the ones that you've been working in and leading, it would take 2 or 3 or 4 generations before they reached their peak. And during that time, you had a split of the wealth of the company many times. And what you have to remember is that now he's getting divorced, so it's split 1 time, but if it was a more slow-growing company, maybe there would be 16 owners of it already by now. Another thing that we need to bear in mind is statistically, sometimes when you see statistics over inequality, you talk about households. And when you get more one-person households, of course that drives up inequality in some of these statistics. Another thing I want to mention is the churn effect. I've seen statistics from Denmark that shows an enormous churn in who is poor and who is rich. So I have been very poor. When I was a student, I was sleeping on some beer boxes on a cardboard thing. So I was very poor, and I've been very wealthy. And then I've had some years with 0 income, and then years with enormous income. So I have personally gone up and down that a lot. 12% of Americans have been among the 1% richest in their life. If you look at the 5% richest, 39% of Americans have been there. If you look at the 20% richest, 73% of Americans have been there. And if you go to the Forbes 400 rich list, 73% of the people who have been there were only there for 1 year. And there are similar statistics for Denmark that I've looked at.
Am I on?
I think you are. No, you're not.
No, you're not?
Next driver that we have to bear in mind is that since 1980, which is exactly the same time that China started introducing market economy, we have seen global inflation go down. And technically, when inflation goes down, the asset prices go up. So this cannot continue forever because inflation is pretty close to zero now, and some countries it's even dipped into negative territory. So this is a driver of inequality that will stop. Another thing I want to mention, I heard this mentioned earlier today also, but the fact that more women take higher education means that you will have more intermarriage between highly educated people. Charles Murray wrote this book called Coming Apart, where he described how in the old days it was typically the men who went to the university and then married a girl that they met at a party or down the street. Now they meet at university, so people with higher income potential they marry, and that drives down. Technically, that increases inequality.
I want to get back to this topic of companies developing fast. Here you see it, and it's not bad. We had the talk yesterday by Mr. Professor Scheuer about the superstar companies. Actually, Apple employees, all of them are very wealthy. This is not bad. We should be careful that we not drive the wealthy down if they carry a big burden of the tax here. But it's clear Rothschild family has very many wealthy members, but none of them are as wealthy as Mackenzie Bezos, just to take a current example. These were some of the pitfalls we think should be given more attention. I want to get into the topic of education. I was very glad to hear the talk from Jente before, and I'm going to go into it in my pet theme here, and that is, I think we should avoid, Susan talked about it yesterday very well, we need to avoid the people falling out of the system downward. It's not about limiting the number of wealthy, it's about avoiding the people falling out of the system. And you very well phrased that. I was really enjoying your speech. And I've made a study on the education of the system. I've taken the Swiss, I've taken the German Bundesländer, I've taken all of the EU countries. And here you see a correlation between the percentage of youngsters that take a baccalaureate and youth unemployment. And this is, in my view, what you start seeing is, if you're not careful, if you schoolify everything, if you believe the best thing in life is to get a college degree, you may be off track. A guy in Switzerland that has an apprenticeship as a masonry guy or something like that, by the time he gets finished, he can afford, out in the Graubünden, for example, he can afford a house, a car, 2 kids, and live well. So we have to be careful that we don't always say these are issues that are very bad, and these are the system doesn't keep people. The same in Germany, same in Denmark. It doesn't keep people on this level. So 22% of the Swiss population takes a baccalaureate or a gymnasium, and 33% go to university or have access to university. Because out of those who take an apprenticeship, 13 total percent, absolute percent actually take that school, but they are actually optimizing their path to their skill set and their personal development set. And this flexibility, I think, is very important, that you give people avenues to optimize their lives themselves.
So Ulf, if I might just ask you, so what you have told me is that you see the benefit that they start working early in life, but also that they get the cultural training from the employer, so they have to deal with clients. And
You're right, I'm going to get to that in a moment, and that is a very important point on freedom and democracy that I'm going to talk about in a moment, that there are implications for societal cohesion by this apprenticeship with education. I'll get to that in a moment. Here we have Switzerland, Denmark put up, but now we're talking about 80% type people. And don't forget, these people, they go to a college and take degrees in things that society may not need that many number of people of. So these people, they actually end up taking a film degree. They are actually taking degrees that there are no jobs for, and then we end up with
something that has the same word in German and Danish, which is called Akademikerproletariat. And so you see, if you drive around the taxis in Europe, and sometimes you ask to talk with a taxi driver, quite often you find out that they're academics. And I don't want to put down taxi driving, but I think it's a waste for a person and a waste for society to take a very long academic education and then not work with anything that is remotely associated with it. So this, when this happened, it does not create social benefit, it actually creates losses.
And just to think about that, these guys have studied probably more than the average usual way of 5 years of studying, probably 8 or 9 years, and enjoyed life. They've driven down the Gini, or driven up the Gini index, because they were poor for all those years. Students are normally poor. And these type of effects I think we should look at when we look at our societal developments, because early on you never studied for 10 years. Today it's regularly happens. So these type of things are a big portion of it.
They're also a big portion of the inequality, because when you study, you are very often registered as a poor person, even though you don't feel poor. I saw that some of the most poor people in the US are people who just graduated with a law degree from Harvard University, but I'm not sure they feel like losers at that point.
Let me get to the people that drop out of the system. Denmark has 20%. I would surmise that have no education at all. Then Switzerland has 6%. You go to UK, US, it's much, much higher. And my big concern here is these guys, they are very susceptible to populism. A guy who goes through apprenticeship, even if he didn't get it at home, he will get it through his apprenticeship. He will learn how society functions. If you want, he will be normalized, and he will understand. He can start voting because he understands the system. People who don't understand the system, they don't know how the system works and don't have so much respect. And to me, this is one of the very key points that we avoid that. I want to get to the consequence of miseducation and talk about the industrial portion of the GDP. Here you see countries, it's not easily read, but it's Switzerland, it's Sweden, it's Austria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Holland, Japan, and ones. And interestingly, many of these had or have apprenticeship education, and they have a high percentage of the GDP is industrial production. So again, here I think you can see at least correlation, if it's not causality. And then more as a joke, we all think that Switzerland is a banking country. Well, you see here, it's a very industrial country. Actually, it is the biggest.
Yeah, so let's just look at Denmark and Switzerland just in a number of comparisons. First thing is that they're almost exactly the same size. The indigenous population is almost exactly the same. Switzerland has far many more immigrants than Denmark. They both have their own currency, their own central bank for the same reason. Both have no natural reserves to speak of. Denmark used to have oil, but that has been burned. And for some reason, there's no oil for it. Where's the oil for? I don't know. But the money has been spent. They're both democracies, but in different ways. They both have low unemployment protection, which Ulf will talk a lot about. One is a high tax nation. It is now the second highest tax pressure in the world, and Switzerland has a low tax system. And there are other differences as well. I'll just take you through some comparisons. The first one I actually want to mention is not this one, but the Where to Be Born Index, which is made by the Economist Intelligence Unit, where Switzerland comes out year after year as the most attractive country in the world overall. World happiness is one where Denmark normally beats Switzerland, but one has to know this, that in Warwick University they made a study of genetic effects. It turns out that there is a Danish gene that enables Danes to recreate serotonin very quickly. So it turns out Danes are very happy no matter where they are. And I can tell you for sure that I live in Switzerland and I'm super happy. So there you go. So, but apart from that, you have Human Development Index, very good index of the ability to get the best out of human potential. Switzerland is number 2, Denmark is number 11 on that one. On which country is the best one to become old in, Switzerland is number 1 in the world, Denmark is number 13. On social progress index, Switzerland is a little bit ahead of Denmark, but also very high in international comparisons. If you look, we spoke about menial vocational education. So Switzerland has very, very good vocational education. Some of them are so attractive that people come from all over the world, for instance, to the Lausanne Hotel School. But the higher educations in Switzerland are of a very high standard. If you look at the QS rankings of the top 200 universities in the world, Switzerland is very high. And actually it's a little bit of an embarrassment for the EU that the two countries in Europe that have the best high educations are Switzerland and UK, which are not members of the EU. But, well, UK, soon. So one of the reasons that they score so high is surely wealth, at least I think so. The other one is that it's harder to get into a university, or that people are more likely to take a vocational education, so fewer people go into university and perhaps better suited for it. If you look at the future, the economy of Switzerland is excellent. They have a surplus on the fiscal account. Denmark has a deficit. On Global Innovation Index, they are year after year the most innovative country in the world. So it's same as global competitiveness. They are year after year the best. So it looks like the economy is really primed for a lot of economic growth and wealth in the future.
We're going to go to decentralization now, but before that, let me just add that innovation, I think, in all the studies you make, and the trend of innovation and the importance of innovation should be given in your studies much more importance, because innovation really transforms societies in such a way and gives also mobility, also social mobility. On to the next one.
So another thing that is one thing that I really noticed as a difference between Switzerland and almost any country, but certainly Denmark, is the decentralization. So when you have decentralized system, whether it's in business or in society, what happens is that the power to decide, the information you decide upon, and enjoying or suffering the consequences of decisions made are closely together. Whereas when you centralize, the power to decide is very far from where the information and the consequence is and is felt. So if we look at Denmark and Switzerland, this is the Danish Government, 23 ministers I think it is. And here you have the Swiss with 7, including a minister for defense and sport. And the size of those two photos is pretty representative for the tax pressure. So if you want to change the tax pressure, just hire or fire some ministers and we'll all sort it out itself out, apparently. If you look at a map of Switzerland, it's very difficult to see all the different boundaries. But Switzerland has 28 cantons, whereas Denmark has 5 regions. Switzerland has 2,200 and some counties. 2,222 counties, and Denmark has 98. So Switzerland is far more decentralized, and so this is a very big difference that I think contribute to a culture of responsibility. And actually, I said for fun that it's the farming that cleans the cars, but I think one reason that Switzerland is so clean is that people decide everything about their local community, and so they feel ownership of their society in a very unique way.
And that's a point that I want to, somehow we have a problem with slides, I think we have, but I will do it without that. This is really an issue which I think that the centralization is something you will see everywhere as a problem. I have a nice example of it out of banking. The Swedes had the real estate crisis early 90s, and what did they invent? The bad bank concept. So when Switzerland had a problem with UBS at the Lehman crisis, what did Switzerland do? We looked around and we found an idea called bad bank in Sweden, copied it, and it went very fast. We implemented that extremely fast. Just think about, we would have had only one central bank. A lot of groupthink, no creativity, no experimentation, and we would have had a lot of different problems. And that's, I think, is something we need to be very careful about. I would have liked to show the picture of the book of Taleb, Anti-Fragile, where he describes this issue of decentralization, where you concentrate insight, consequence, and power, and therefore take much better decisions. And his example is the most resilient industry in the world is the restaurant industry. The restaurant industry is great because the restaurants, you have people doing it well, and then others copy it, others do it badly, and you see how not to do it. So you really learn, and that type of thing, you think about, you would have a Bernese food industry governed from Bern. Just think about the quality of food we would have. So I think we should be very careful that this decentralization lowers societal risk when things go wrong. If China goes wrong, US goes wrong, all of Europe goes wrong, it's each time a major issue. If Switzerland or Denmark goes wrong, it's a blip in the world. So that's, I think, is something I really caution us to take a serious view on, and also look at the risks when you do your analysis on these discontinuities in society that often come associated with the bad development of Gini. Now we get to assets.
Yeah, so here I think the sad irony is that very often the reason for centralizing is to avoid mistakes. So you want to centralize power to make central standard rules so mistakes cannot happen. And very often what happens is if you don't allow any mistakes or don't allow any risk, you don't get the benefits either. One example is a calculation made by the economist Jeremy Siegel, where he calculated if you had a dollar in 1802, of all numbers, in 1802, what would the purchasing power be going forward to 2014? So if you had it in cash, it would lose 95% of its purchasing power. Put it in gold, you would get $3. Bear in mind that this axis is exponential. If you had it in cheap bills, which are low risk government bonds, you would have $275. If you had it in bonds, which are higher risk bonds, it's $1,642. But if you put it in equities, which is very high risk, you have $1 million. So it accumulates a lot. So some societies encourage people to invest in ways that are risky, and those societies get far more wealthy. There was a fantastic point during the crisis, just before the EU were making their big transfer to Greece, where there came out a study that showed that Greek people on average had higher net wealth than Germans. And that it was leaked out, but only published after the transfer had taken place. But Germans are not that wealthy, and the reason is that they don't invest their money very well. So if you have laws that prevent people's pensions from being invested fully in equities and force them into government bonds, you simply prevent normal people from having asset appreciation.
And that's happening. That's happening today.
This is happening. Whereas more wealthy people, they will typically, of course, they have this pension which is bound, but for their own money, they will invest in much higher risk assets, and then it becomes much more wealthy. So this is an example where the law keeps the poor down, but not the rich.
And this has turned much worse in the last years after Lehman. In Switzerland, pension companies cannot invest anymore in attractive instruments. So I'm president of a pension fund, and the life insurance companies don't want to work with us because they say we lose money the way it's organized now, we can't. And this is bad because it hurts the people who have their money into these pension funds.
Let's talk about
taxes.
Right? Yeah. So tax is actually one of my favorite subjects, and I made a speech at the Danish political party convention, although I'm not political, but I was invited, and I spoke for 45 minutes, and only at one point did I get a standing applause, and that was when I was reciting the Swiss Constitution. I was completely not prepared for that. But the Swiss Constitution says that the state cannot collect more than 11.5% income tax, 8.5% corporate tax, 8% VAT, now the top VAT is 7.7. And since I think 2003, it cannot systematically assume more debt. So this is a constitutional minimal state. And that is one of the reasons that tax pressure in Switzerland has been kept down. Of course, you collect taxes at the cantonal and the community level, but that's under competition. So if you raise taxes too much, people will migrate and vote with their feet. So the typical marginal tax rate in Switzerland is around 30%. It's much higher in the French part, much lower in the central Swiss part, German part. There's no capital gains tax on financial investments. Wealth tax is 0 to 0.5% typically. VAT 2.5 to 7.7%. So if you look at the Danish tax pressure, on the other hand, you can see that this has risen a lot, and as I said earlier, Denmark now has the second highest tax pressure in the world, just superseded by France this year. And if you to put it in perspective, here we have the tax pressure in Singapore today. Here we have the tax pressure in central Switzerland, so Zug, Schwyz, and so on. Here we have the tax pressure in all of Switzerland, so Denmark is really an outlier on that. So it's very important to discuss what are the consequences of this for society. So my take on it is that Denmark has become over-institutionalized because of this, and one consequence or one effect is that people have been pushed out of the labor market and instead live of transfer income. So here you have a graph that shows the number of Danes that have the main income from transfer instead of from working.
Out of 5 million. Enter into transaction between each other. You go higher than that, you will see black economy developing, and you will see issues happening there. And I am very concerned that we are moving, all of us, because we don't see these things happening. We just believe tax is good. It may be good to redistribute, but you will surely tell me it's not good to be latent poor or on transfer income. You should have said it before, and you can say it now.
To me, when you measure misery, one thing is economic misery, but the other thing is that the feeling of misery when you're not able to support yourself. You can only sustain a dignified life by getting state aid. And you have a lot more in Denmark of that you have in Switzerland. Switzerland people are much more likely to actually be able to sustain themselves. The other kind of misery is the ones who are latently fired. So in companies where you want to fire people but you cannot do it, the people, they keep their job but they actually feel that they are not desired.
And can I just go on to that? I skipped that for some stupid reason. This is not very easy to get scientific numbers on the unemployment effects, but I've made a less scientific approach to it. I hope there are people in the room to pick it up and do a better study on it. But these are 4 countries. You have the dismissal red tape, you have taxes, and you have transfer income. And interestingly, Switzerland has low dismissal red tape. Denmark has low dismissal red tape. Denmark has high taxes. So there are 2 countries with both very low unemployment, as you see on the right-hand side. These are 20-year average of unemployment. I purposely took a long view because you can't say the euro advantage of Germany is really a significant endogenic factor. And what's interesting is all of these countries pay equally when we fire the people. They all get the same. I've unfortunately had to do it both in France and Germany and Holland, Denmark and so on. That's not the issue. The issue is the dismissal red tape. And that is what happens, that you have people spending latent fired, so they feel badly, but they spend precious years of their time, of their life, in obsolete jobs, not getting early retrained before into what society will need for the future. And I believe this dismissal red tape, as I call it, is a well-meant thing for labor protection, but it actually may backfire and increase the inequality very dramatically because people spend precious years of their lives in things they shouldn't be spending their time on because technology is changing. And there I believe we should be very, very careful that we don't take and go ahead all the time to think that all these things are good. So transfer income and dismissal red tape, I believe, can be very dangerous. There are good things about it. Don't feel this should be all ethically handled and be rightly handled. And in Denmark, you can do that.
Yeah, so in Denmark, 1/3 of the working population change job every year. So that shows the importance of the whole issue in these comparisons. Now, one thing I want to bring up is when Switzerland has low tax rates, does that mean that they can't afford to help people who need help? And it turns out when you compare the numbers that the tax per capita is about the same in Denmark and Switzerland, even though Switzerland had far lower tax rates. What the difference comes when you look at the private sector, where the private sector per capita is about twice as big as in Switzerland. So the way Switzerland mainly addresses social challenges is by having a lot of well-paid, low-taxed jobs, whereas Denmark has a lot less of that. And so Denmark has to use a very big proportion of this for transfer income. Switzerland uses a far smaller proportion of this for transfer income. Instead, it is used for having excellent core services. So this is a difference, and it shows that there is, in the long term, zero cost in having lower tax pressure, but a lot of benefits. So one example of the outcome of this is that Switzerland, for instance, has 3 times as big export as Denmark and much bigger surplus on the trade account. If you look at another thing that happens when you move a bigger part to the public sector is that the productivity growth goes down. There was a big study of that in Denmark that shows that the primary sector, so mining, farming, and so on, had a 6.5% average annual productivity gain since almost World War II. And if you look at industry, it was 3.1%, private services 1.8%, but public services had zero since 1940. Zero. And McKinsey Global Institute, which has advised a number of nations on public sector productivity, had found that the typical tendency in all countries, across the world, is around zero productivity gain in the public sector. So, of course, in the long term, a very big public sector means a lower wealth generation, and that hurts everybody.
The worldwide average cost of government is 2.3%. Compare that with a growth rate of 2.5%, and you know what you're up against if the public sector is very, very big. It's a very, very important point. And that brings me to bureaucracy. We all think that putting regulations in helps. We can do things better for people. What we tend to forget is that bureaucracy is one of the biggest drivers of limiting social mobility. Bureaucracy. We often think that we have transfer income, we take taxes and move them to the poor. Regularly, when you look at it, 20% of it lands with the poor, 80% is consumed in the bureaucracy. So we are actually not seeing the effect of the intention when we see how it is executed due to the cost of it. And I just as a little example, I met the CEO of Citigroup, Mike Corbett, and Sergio Amotti last week at a speech. And they both complained about regulation intensity. And they said they had implemented compliance regulations in 100 countries, 1,200 in 1 year, which was 5 a day in many countries. And they complained, but they admitted upon question, of course, that was the biggest thing they could have, these regulations, because small companies had no chance. That kills the small companies. We all know the carpenter or whatever who comes home, has dinner with the kids, and what does he do at night? He sits and does all the administration. That makes social mobility totally impossible. And there I think we should be very careful that we don't drive that. Here's an example of the American regulation intensity, quite a dramatic one. And I'm going to come to a point now which is a little bit of a joke at the same time. I hope you enjoy it. This was the poverty rate in the US, and it was falling until they started the war on poverty. The moment they started the war on poverty, poverty didn't get lower. Now, there can be many other exogenic factors, but I will surmise that this is something we see, and I have many examples of it, that policy achieves the opposite of what you want. You have to be extremely careful with policy. There are actually investment theses in the world that says if a politician announces a certain direction, invest in the opposite, they will achieve the opposite. And we need to be careful that we understand how we achieve these things. We are very concerned in these many examples that the opposite was achieved or was set out to be. Well, those were our slides. We get to some conclusions. I will start with one. Modest tax pressure. I do believe you should pay taxes. Absolutely. There is no reason not to have a functioning society. And it should be, taxes systems can be different, but it should be clearly paid. But don't overdo it. You put up trade barriers between the people.
Yeah, so basically with a high tax pressure, you marginalize a lot of people that are forced out of the labor market, and you use the taxes you have collected to save them, but you created the problem in the first place through this. Do you click for this next one?
I can click, it's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, the next one is flexicurity, which you have in Denmark and in Switzerland, where it's easy to fire people. And what I think is interesting is that when we've seen this presentation before, that some of the things we talk about is not covered in what you measure against. And for instance, I think flexicurity is very important.
The other one is accepting more risk in society. If you don't do that, you hurt the poor, clearly.
And then
avoiding risk is not a way to survive.
And then simpler regulation, because as Ulf said, regulation relatively benefit the very big established companies, but it hurts the young startup companies, and therefore it also hurts social mobility.
And then my pet theme, apprenticeship education, which I believe is one of the big reasons for a cohesive society and less youth unemployment. And then we have just a general attitude of supporting private enterprise, because they create jobs, and jobs are the best and most meaningful way to address social challenges versus transfer income. So these were conclusions, and now 2 final words.
Okay.
I think I stopped. You can go on, I'll start with this one. This is Popper. He's not uncontroversial, but nevertheless I will allow myself to quote at least this one. I do believe that we should have respect that these systems we work with people, are so multidimensional that modeling can make the outcome come out the opposite. So you have to be extremely careful. And some of the research we saw today I really enjoy, because it takes down to the single factors and we understand them. And I think that is very important if we want to be sure that we don't achieve the opposite of what we want. I think the goal for us all, equal opportunity, is clear. The goal for us, Gini index better, is clear. It's just we might achieve sometimes the opposite.
Yeah, and that brings to the last slide, which is this quote: "The society that puts equality before freedom will end up with neither. The society that puts freedom before equality will end up a great measure of both." And I think the claim we have made here today is that Switzerland actually falls in that camp, and on international comparisons it tends to come as number 1 or one of the top countries on social and humanistic indicators. So Switzerland has prioritized freedom, and that has worked very well for the people who might have been losers but are not, because they were born in Switzerland or live in Switzerland, including the 4.5 million people who migrated to Switzerland to enjoy this fantastic society.
And we're on time. Feel free to ask questions. Yeah.
So I used to be a huge fan of decentralisation, and I still am for everything except housing, because in the UK we have a very decentralised planning system that results in a huge amount of opposition to development, and that's basically the main cause of our housing crisis. So do you think that housing policy is a potential exception to decentralisation being a good thing?
That's a very interesting point, because of course housing as such is very correlated to asset inflation, to interest rates, which are governmental policies or national bank policies. And in that sense, there are elements that take centralized elements. There are certain elements in society that should not be decentralized, like defense and this case of the national bank. But I would still surmise that there are elements of it that you can still do decentralized, but some of them certainly not.
There's in Switzerland you have clearly, because tax pressure are quite different locally, sometimes very different, that when you take down the tax pressure, everybody comes to that canton and it becomes extremely wealthy. But then the house prices go up, and at a certain level, house prices are so high that they force some of the poorer people, but the less wealthy people, out of the canton. And for that reason, many of them address it by allocating some land for social housing so that they can stay where they were born. And so, yeah, I would definitely be a fan of that.
More questions? Felix Zero.
Let me, since this has been so practical and relevant, let me make one maybe more political or philosophical remark. The mantra of bureaucracy and regulation. We hear it in every AGM, in every interview, and you know, the conclusions, the statement which has been made, I fully agree. There is, however, a big however. The however is that the bad sides of bureaucracy and regulation, there are also good sides to regulation, are to a significant part self-inflicted by those who complain. Because the list of failures of large players in economy, whether it's in Switzerland, whether it's abroad. And I'm not going to do the list, we all know it. You know, as a government-owned enterprise in Switzerland systematically defrauding the Swiss taxpayer, a whole industry systematically defrauding its customers and the state, etc., etc., etc. And it seems to me that we have not yet found the liberal response to how to address that. Now it's increasingly coming out of the core of capitalism. You know, I would encourage everybody to read the annual letters of Larry Finks from BlackRock, from the largest investor in the world, you know, who is trying to find a response to what has been largely unresponded so far.
Yeah, Felix, I think you have a very good point. Let me just give you one comment on it. I do not believe the response to misdoings is more regulation.
No, I'm not suggesting that.
Get those guys in jail, period. The problem we have, I can only say it in German, but we have very little Rechtssicherheit in many countries today because lawyers, and you are one, but I'm not complaining about you, but lawyers and the judicial system protract every wrongdoing for years and years instead of getting clear judicial rulings and get the consequence of wrongdoing clearly visible fast. And I believe the solution by just making more regulations doesn't solve it. Put them in jail.
No, but Ulf, you know, and I don't want to monopolize the discussion. You know, you are starting at the back end.
No.
You're starting at the back end. You know, the liberal response would be to make the cases who have to go to the judiciary and to enforcement to reduce this number. That would be the truly liberal response. You know, and I'm not suggesting that you can solve the problem by more regulation. Absolutely not. But we have to find, because we are unfortunately talking of systemic deficiencies. If it were just the one and the other case popping up, it would be easy. But we are talking of a systemic problem. And you can't solve the problem of a systemic problem by essentially tightening enforcement.
Yeah, if I may just comment on that. First of all, I think it's natural you get more regulation because you get more products and more technologies, so you get more complication. The problem, though, is that a lot of regulation is not necessary, and people don't factor in the cost to society of managing those regulations. I want to just say one thing, that during the last 10 years we've had a very big growth in an efficient rating economy, rating services of all sorts. And a lot of things can be addressed because now people rate restaurants and so on. And so it's easier to vote with the feet. That doesn't mean that we don't need regulation for systemic fraud or systemic abuse, as you say. We just need to be very careful that it very often has some secondary effects that are very negative.
Last question before we close the session to Raphael.
Thank you. In the presentation before the break, we saw Mr. Keki showing us a graph where we saw that the correlation between the education level of the parent and the child is increasing in Switzerland. And this may, of course, create problems. What is your take on that development? The correlation between the education level of the parent and of the child is increasing. So previously, parents with little education had very often children with higher education levels. Now the correlation has increased. So very educated parents have very educated children. Parents with little education have children with little education, and that has increased. So basically, the Swiss education system seems to fail in compensating the effects of socioeconomic strata.
Just be careful, is little education bad? I really mean it. Are you more happy just because you've gone to university? I mean, I've started in school, so I'm in the system and I see that, and a lot of it's a private school, so I see people paying for getting their kids to get to the gymnasium and get to the university, And I often ask myself, these children would be much more happy. And it goes like that. Well, take the gymnasium, go to university, and if you can't make it, you can always become a teacher. This drives the education level up because parents think that's the right for their children. But you can be much more happy maybe. And the most highest entrepreneurial degree are between people who have taken apprenticeship.
That's possible, but apparently the mixing doesn't work. If mixing happened, then
That's true.
and so we should think of possibilities to increase the mixing between the population.
I agree with that.
And
And
do you
that's the
have
problem.
any suggestion concerning that,
Well,
or any interpretation of the phenomenon and what you could do about it?
increasing the social status of apprenticeship and increasing the salary of apprentices and making it clear how much they actually make afterwards is probably the best way. And I see no other way, actually. But there may be other ways, but that's...
That was a good final remark. Great, thank you very much.